What happened to this team? This team was competing for championships. This team had the best driver, crew chief team combo in NASCAR only 4 years ago, and it's going to be gone at the end of the year? This is insane. This is something that I don't think has happened in any way, maybe ever. So let's look back a little bit at this. The first 3 years of this team were probably a new owner's dream. As Haas had merged up with Tony Stewart, they'd linked up and had made Stewart-Haas Racing from the old Haas team. And in 2009, both drivers, Tony Stewart and Ryan Newman, are in the chase. And Smoke spent most of the year leading the points or being a championship-level driver in year one. 2010 was solid for Stewart, not so good for Newman, but still, it was a great start. And while the 14 struggled early on in the regular season, both made the chase in 2011, and we all know that Tony Stewart just went off. And he went off. 5 for 10, half the chase races won, wins the championship in a tiebreaker with probably the most consistent driver of that season, for sure probably, and still with that, they let go of Darian Grubb. But overall, it's not too bad of a time for Stewart-Haas Racing, seeing how they are a championship-winning team by the third year of their existence. Now, those first 3 years, I think, can be sectioned off on their own. From there, you have the next 2 years, 2012 and 2013. This is kind of a flux period. There's a bit of downturn here, but every team naturally has ebbs and flows. It's not necessarily something to really get all hot and bothered over. Stewart-Haas in 2012 and 13 was not great. You had Smoke's career downturn starting at this point. He was out with an injury for the end of the season in 2013, and only one of his final 4 seasons were run completely, which is all 36 races. And by the end of this period, even though he did get a win at the Brickyard, even though he did make the chase, it was time for Ryan Newman to leave. And what this did, even with Danica joining as a third team and not really being all that great, was make the greatest and the prime years of Stewart-Haas Racing in a sort of rebirth from 2014 to 2020. Kevin Harvick comes to the team and immediately comes in and wins the NASCAR Cup Series championship. And with that, Kevin Harvick would be one of the 3 or 4 most elite drivers of the 2010s decade, almost all in part to what he did at Stewart-Haas Racing paired with Rodney Childers. This was a driver-crew chief pairing that, up until the end of Harvick's career, would be one of the best in NASCAR, no matter which way you slice it. And then you got Kurt Busch. Kurt Busch will be added to the team in 2014. This is where one of the small first cracks in this team begins, though. Not with Busch himself. Busch ended up being a fine driver with Stewart-Haas Racing, and he really defined the 41 car, which has not been in any way recovered since. Instead, Tony Stewart found out about this by watching SportsCenter. It was done behind his back by Gene Haas, creating a 4th team, and with that, you can kind of see a little disconnect. But it didn't matter because Kevin Harvick won the championship that year and the team was starting to fire on all cylinders. They were killing it with the 4 and the 41, and even with Tony Stewart having a career downturn, he ended on a high note with a great win at Sonoma. 2017 and 2018 saw the real upgrades. First, they switched to Ford. Instead of being second fiddle of the Hendrick Motorsports at Chevrolet, they would be one of the Tier 1 Ford teams. And with it, you would also see what would become another crack in the dam for them. But with this, also, you had new drivers. Tony Stewart would retire and Clint Bowyer would take over for him. And with how bad Stewart had gotten by the end of his career, this was a true improvement, and Bowyer looked pretty good for a couple years there. Almirola took over for Danica after 2017, and let's be honest, any driver that wasn't basically a wreck magnet would be better than Danica Patrick, the ultimate NASCAR wreck magnet. And with this, 2018 would be their best season yet. All 4 cars were competitive. All 4 cars in the playoffs and winning. It looked great. It looked like Stewart-Haas Racing was going to be that next super team, the next Hendrick Motorsports, the next Joe Gibbs Racing. They had their defining moment, in my opinion, at Talladega in the fall of 2018. These 4 cars, if it wasn't for fuel mileage, would have finished 1, 2, 3, 4 as they ran almost the entire day. These cars were the pinnacle of the field, and the legit discussion after this race was, how did they cheat? Because they cannot be that good, but they just were. It was probably one of the single best single race clinics that a team has ever put on the field at Talladega in the restrictor plate super speedway era. Another crack, though, came to the dam in 2019. Kurt Busch would leave for Ganassi, and while Suarez was there for a year and Custer and Preece had followed up after that, the 41 team has not been the same since Kurt Busch left, and Stewart-Haas Racing, really, aside from Kevin Harvick, was not the same afterwards, going winless. It was clear his veteran leadership was needed, which did help at Ganassi in later 2311. And with this, you started to see a bit more falling apart from it. But still, no major cracks or even breaking of the dam of competition for them yet, until 2020, which was the beginning of the end. First off, you had the COVID pandemic that changed everything, and while the rest of Stewart-Haas Racing continued to struggle, Kevin Harvick actually seemed to be the driver who excelled the most, winning 9 races, most of which coming before the playoffs. He was on top of the world, but even after having one of the best modern seasons in NASCAR, 9 wins, it was the final round of the playoffs and some bad calls by NASCAR in large part that took him out of the championship contention. I mean, you look at Kansas, for instance. He finished second to Joey Logano, even though he had a vastly superior car due to NASCAR's terrible aero package. Then at Texas, while leading the race, it was misting out and the track was wet, but NASCAR kept them out there. Harvick, being the first one through it, slides up into the wall, smacks the fence, and finishes in a mediocre spot, way down the lineup where he wouldn't have otherwise. And then at Martinsville, he was desperate and tried to crash Kyle Busch in the final lap, ultimately failing to continue on to the next round. This was probably a huge breaking point, I think, competition-wise for Stewart-Haas Racing. But I think another major piece of the puzzle here is Kyle Larson. Kyle Larson had been indefinitely suspended from NASCAR for a reason we pretty much all know, and with that, he was going to be the hottest free agent on the market, one of the most talented drivers just on raw talent alone that NASCAR's ever seen, and Tony Stewart wanted him. Tony Stewart was probably the heaviest bidder to get this generational talent, and then all of a sudden, he wasn't, and he would end up going to Hendrick Motorsports, where Rick Hendrick and Kyle Larson capitalized into one of the most lucrative on-track partnerships probably in the last 5 years, and Larson absolutely dominated the NASCAR Cup Series. When pressed about it on Instagram and Twitter, Tony Stewart pretty much said it was Ford that squashed the entire deal. And with that, I think really made a huge rift between not only Ford and Tony Stewart, but Tony Stewart and his team and NASCAR in general. And so you have 2021 to 2023. In this time, the team only wins 4 races in this 3-year span after winning 10 in just 2020 alone. Boyer retires, and instead Briscoe's put in. A fine driver, but not somebody who can carry the rest of the team and even stack up to a declining Kevin Harvick. Harvick would be the lone wolf who'd consistently run well. But another big part of what I think really started to get Tony Stewart away from this was the fact that his team got penalized almost every year. And the biggest one, I think, was probably, at least for Stewart, Cole Custer's at the Roval in 2022 for manipulating the playoffs, in NASCAR's opinion, which was 50 points and $100,000. Smoke would later on be quoted as saying, "Looking for a new weekend hobby. Something not Southeastern based, if anyone has any ideas. Something low drama and relaxing, preferably." And since this quote, Tony Stewart has in large part been absent from the face of the sport. And come 2023, well, Stewart-Haas Racing has its first winless season as Kevin Harvick ends his career and Aric Almirola as well retires from full-time driving, taking sponsorship away, on top of Kevin Harvick's sponsorship leaving for the most part. Rumors had been swirling about the downsizing of the team, or possibly even leaving Ford for Chevrolet or maybe Honda if they came into NASCAR. And these continued into 2024. It was clear that Tony Stewart's team was not going to be one of the superpowers anymore. They hadn't been in a couple of years, but the team had rebranded. There were new drivers now, like Noah Gragson, as well as Josh Berry. And the rumors, while still swirling, were kind of getting pushed down a little bit because the team was starting to perform better. It wasn't necessarily running for wins, but it was still good. But unfortunately, the damage was done. And even after all of that, this week we found out Tony Stewart's team, Stewart-Haas Racing, would be leaving NASCAR. More than likely in both the Cup and Xfinity series based on all reports. So what's the verdict? What's the cause of death? In my opinion, it's ownership. It's all ownership. And it all goes back to that. Tony Stewart has always been at odds with NASCAR through his driving career and ownership career. And that was never going to change. And that was never going to be something that I think either could come to grips with. And the 2020s only drove a larger wedge, whether it be on the track or stuff between NASCAR's penalties and Stewart, or just falling away from it because he didn't like the rules, whatever it might be. Plus, meeting and building a life with Leah Pruitt, his now wife, which I will say I respect him for choosing that. That's not going to help keep him invested in NASCAR either when he truly has a new love in his life. And on top of all of that, well, Stewart never took accountability either. And that was the same for Gene Haas, who seemingly was absent for the vast majority of this time. I mean, how many times in this video did I mention Tony Stewart and how invested he would have been compared to Gene Haas? I think it's pretty telling. Neither owner communicated with the other, and maybe even with the organization overall. And I think that a couple weeks ago, Kevin Harvick was the canary in the coal mine. He was the one who was telling us basically what was coming. And it all came down to his comments at North Wilkesboro. While a sad story, it at least is one that was filled with a lot of highs and a lot of great moments, and maybe can end on a high note at the end of the 2024 season. But with that, I want to pass this on to you and ask, what do you think the cause of death for Tony Stewart's team, Stewart-Haas Racing, is? Because it really wasn't Gene Haas's at any point. So what do you think really was? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're at it, leave a like on this video, share this video, and subscribe to this channel for more great and fun NASCAR content. Thank you so much to all my channel members for your continued support, and until next time, have a good one.